Hello and welcome to Stringham School's Real Estate Edge. This is part one of a two-part interview with our guest, Special Agent Scown from the local office of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Agent Scown, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me today.
How long have you been with the FBI?
Just a little more than 12 years so far.
I see. And how did you happen to end up in Salt Lake?
Well, this is my third office that I've been in, so I just had the opportunity to transfer down here as part of the normal course of my career.
I see. And what was your motivation 12 years ago to join the FBI?
Well, I've always been interested in service jobs. I was in the military for a little while as well, and I just wanted to be able to serve the United States. And also, I studied accounting in school, and I really wanted to be able to put that education to work in investigating fraud matters.
It just seemed like a good fit, and one thing led to another.
Yeah, I was fortunate to get picked up.
Excellent. Well, our subject today is money laundering, and perhaps we could start with a definition of money laundering from the FBI's standpoint.
Well, money laundering can be pretty broad, but basically it's any time someone uses their ill-gotten gains, takes their ill-gotten gains and tries to move it through the financial system or through alternate systems to try to get it to a place where they can use it without law enforcement detecting it.
I see.
So if someone has money that they've stolen, then obviously they have to worry about the FBI or another law enforcement agency eventually tracing it and finding it. So the more complexity they can introduce to their laundering scheme, the safer they feel in us not finding those funds at a later time.
Mm-hmm. So then the purpose behind money laundering is to utilize funds openly that have been gained through illegal activities. It's just disguise the source of the funds.
That's correct.
And how does money laundering work? Can you give us kind of maybe an example of the process? How would one go about disguising the use of these funds?
There's a lot of different ways. It can be as simple as just one level where the bad guy gets money into their account and then transfers it to another account, rather. Mm-hmm. But it can also get pretty complex where they use international money mule networks or virtual currencies to try to disguise the funds and make it more difficult for law enforcement to trace. What we're seeing the most of right now that we find the most concerning is the use of money mule networks by both domestic and international fraud groups. And what those folks do, what they use money mules for is to move money all throughout the United States and then have the final money mule send that money to the overseas fraudster. Mm-hmm. And oftentimes when someone is a victim of a scam, they're less likely to send money overseas to a bad guy as they are to someone in the United States. And so a fraudster will recruit a money mule inside the United States to put their victim at ease.
You use the term money mule. Does that suggest that they physically transport the funds from one area to another, or they move it electronically, or both?
It could be both, but typically it's electronically. So often what happens is someone who is a money mule, and as an aside, a money mule can either be witting or unwitting, mm-hmm. meaning they either know that they're involved in a scam or they're completely unaware and they're being victimized themselves. But oftentimes they'll be contacted by a fraudster who will ask them to receive funds into their own bank account and then either transfer those funds to the bad guy or to another money mule through a wire transfer or through MoneyGram or Western Union, other mm-hmm. money service businesses, or go and purchase gift cards that they then provide the gift card information to the fraudster.
If you're moving the money physically, I would presume that you wouldn't try to get on an airplane with a bag full of money because it would more than likely be detected, I would assume.
Right, and that's why most folks are now using these more inside the system methods, whether it be through bank accounts, wire transfers, or these money service businesses to transfer those funds, because it's just a lot simpler
Sure.
and cheaper and safer for the bad guy
Indeed.
as opposed to having to fly
Sure.
somebody with physical cash.
Based on your earlier comment, I sense that the FBI is not the only agency responsible for law enforcement of money laundering. Who are some of the other agencies that you would work with?
Well, on a federal level, we work very closely with the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Group, IRS-CI. We work extensively with them. We also work with the United States Postal Inspection Service and just other federal agencies as well as we try to combat this
Hmm.
threat.
Any local agencies involved in money laundering?
Well, we often receive referrals and complaints from local agencies who have victims that they identify in their jurisdictions,
I see.
and then we work those cases with them jointly as much as we
Hmm.
can.
Can you give us some particular signs that our viewers, that all of us should be sensitive to, that would indicate the possibility of a laundering effort?
Well, anytime that you're asked to be involved in a transaction that really aren't a party to, or it doesn't make sense for you to be involved in that transaction, that should give people a lot of pause. And that's really what happens with these money mules that we encounter. They are asked to receive money and then send it to somebody else, but there's really no business purpose for them to be involved in the transaction. And so anytime you come across that, people should be aware and probably reach out to law enforcement for guidance.
Hmm. And would you suggest that they call the FBI directly, or local law enforcement first? What would be the kind of the protocol?
Either way, so whether it's the FBI or another federal agency or a local law enforcement agency, any of those law enforcement officers will be able to give really good advice to someone
Hmm.
who's potentially being recruited to be used in a money laundering scheme. For us, we take tips online, and we also have a national hotline.
Hmm. We all know or have heard that money laundering is bad for the economy. It's
Mhm.
kind of a dark side of the economy. Could you give us an example or two about what are some of the specific negatives that the average business person or individual might incur in a money laundering scheme?
Well, the biggest problem that comes up is it just makes it so difficult for law enforcement to be able to trace those funds. So anyone can become a victim of a fraud here in the United States, whether it's through a business email compromise, if it's someone in a business environment, or if it's someone that is buying or selling property, they can become a victim of a business email compromise. But as that happens, obviously, uh, the way that money laundering affects those folks is then it can be very difficult after the money has been laundered or gone through these different layers of laundering for us to then recover those funds,
I see.
especially if those funds have left the United States.
So it sounds like at some point somebody's going to lose.
Absolutely.
Can you give us an idea how money laundering would impact real estate? Why would real estate be a method of laundering money?
Well, obviously, if real estate holds value typically, and
Indeed.
so for ill-gotten gains, if money can be put into real estate, at least for a period of time, it can be very useful to both maintain value and then to clean those funds. But a lot of what we're seeing is as well right now, as I mentioned before, is the issue with in real estate transactions, people being sent emails saying, "Hey, send your money. We need to send the money right now. Send it to this with this different wiring information,"
Hmm.
and then that turns into being fraudulent wiring information, and people lose those funds. And as I mentioned before, business email compromise. That's typically what we refer to
Sure.
that as.
Does the size of real estate, meaning more zeros, it's an expensive asset, does that have a tendency to attract potential scamsters just because of the sheer size?
Well, absolutely. Real estate's a huge industry. In addition to that,
Indeed.
there can be significant fluctuations, which is attractive to people engaging in fraud schemes as
Hmm.
well.
Probably a difficult question, but does the FBI spend a lot of their time on money laundering? I know there's a lot of demand for your time, a lot of crime. It seems like going
Right.
on, but is this a major consumption of your time, of the FBI's time?
Well, as you said, the FBI investigates a whole broad, diverse spectrum of criminal violations as well as national security matters. But as far as money laundering is concerned, we most of our cases are going to involve some level of money laundering, and we're then going to investigate that. For just money laundering itself, without some sort of underlying charge, we oftentimes are looking for facilitators of money laundering. So that can be bankers, accountants, lawyers, real estate professionals who support these groups wittingly. So we oftentimes try to go after those facilitators to try to disrupt those networks.
I see. Is there one particular large group of money laundering? Terrorists, drug cartels, organized crime. Is there one that kind of stands out as, for lack of a better word, a leader of the money laundering process?
Well, all of those groups have to launder
All the above.
their ill-gotten gains, if you will, right? But as I've mentioned before, the biggest problem we're facing right now, especially for folks who target older Americans, is these money mule networks that overseas fraudsters use to target Americans and then move billions of dollars outside the United States every year. That's a major threat to the United States that we are investigating very seriously. In addition to that, it's been a priority over the last few years for the U.S. Department of Justice, which the FBI is part of, to investigate fraudsters who are trying to take advantage of older Americans.
The concept of a money mule is, I find, sort of interesting and intriguing. How does one go about becoming a money mule? Not that I'm proposing that as an occupation, but how would a fraudster find a mule to transport or be involved? Is it sort of a blackmail process, or?
It can be, but usually it's a trust process. So there's any number of different ways that someone can be recruited to be a money mule. But what we're seeing most commonly right now is through romance scams. So what that involves is often someone who is lonely and looking for companionship meets someone online who it turns out to be a fraudster. And over a period of months, they develop a romantic relationship with their victim. And after they've built that trust, they will get as much money as they can from the victim and then also start to use them as a money mule. So they'll contact the victim, who, once again, the victim now trusts this person, and they'll say, oh, hey, I need to send some money to your account. They'll have any number of different reasons why they need to send that money. Oh, I'm overseas, and so my U.S. bank account is closed, and this is a payment for services I rendered previously, or any number of reasons. And then they'll usually allow them to keep some of the money for their trouble, and then ask them to forward it on to them. Now, that could be sending it to another money mule to make the laundering more layered and more complex, more difficult for law enforcement to unravel, or it could be sending it directly to them either through a wire transfer or through sending cash itself through the mail, or through, like I mentioned before, gift cards or money service businesses.
Can you give us an idea of what we as individuals, particularly those of us in real estate, what can we do to recognize perhaps some of the early signs of money laundering?
Well, anytime that there's a transaction that doesn't make sense to you, you should start asking questions and questioning in your own mind what is going on. I find that a lot of people, when they become involved in a fraudulent transaction, they maybe saw some warning signs, but they worried, oh, well, maybe I just don't understand, or maybe I'm not educated or smart enough to understand what's going on here. And this person that's selling me this bill of goods, if you will, they understand this better. And so we as humans, we don't want to look silly.
Of course.
And so sometimes we don't ask the questions that we should ask for fear of looking uneducated. And so anytime you don't understand something, whether it's a client that you're working with or yourself as a real estate professional, if you don't understand what's going on with a particular transaction or the business purpose of that transaction, you should ask questions until you understand why that's occurring.
So if it seems too good to be true,
it is.
It possibly isn't.
Yeah.
Do banks play a major role in sort of the line of defense against money laundering?
They do. There's lots of anti-money laundering laws that banks have to comply with, and they all have systems in place to try to uncover, laundering that's occurring in the United States.
What are some of the penalties for money laundering?
Well, it can be varied and different. There's statutory maximums inside the United States Criminal Code for how long someone can be put in prison for money laundering. And there's also fines associated with that. But at the end of the day, it's really difficult to know how much time or how much prison time someone would get, or what sort of fines they'd have to pay, because obviously each case is different, and the judge of the case, the actual district court judge, if it's a federal case, has to look at all the facts and circumstances and decide what is most just. So it can vary a lot, and once again, it varies based on the judge's determination and also just on the facts and circumstances.
So as in most criminal cases, it's sort of unique to the circumstances surrounding that.
Each case is different, yeah.
Is there one particular industry that is perhaps more vulnerable? I know real estate is a pretty subject property that may attract illegal investors, but are there other industries that would tend to attract this type of application of illegal funds?
Well, like you said, real estate's a big one because of all the zeros involved, right? But obviously, investment securities are a large area that we see people launder money through, or there's scams that then funds are laundered out of, and those are probably the ones that we see most commonly.
Are there certain states or cities that tend to attract more money laundering activities than others? Or is that a statistic that's kind of hard to track?
So that's an interesting question. Obviously, bigger markets are going to have bigger crime problems.
Sure.
Not because people there are worse than other people. It's just there's more money
people,
to be
more
had,
money,
right? So obviously bigger markets are going to have bigger problems with money laundering or any kind of fraud that can occur. But that being said, with the reach of communications now through the internet, whether you're in New York City or LA, or whether you're in rural Utah, rather, you can be caught involved in one of these money laundering schemes. So with the reach of communications, it's easy for someone, even not in a big city, to become involved in something much larger.
You mentioned rural communities, so they're just, it sounds like that they're just as susceptible as larger metropolitan areas.
Absolutely.
And maybe more so just because they are somewhat out of the way and lower profile, lower activities.
Well, and I've lived in big cities and I've lived in small towns. And one of the benefits to small towns is you kind of have more of a community feel, and you feel like you can trust your neighbors more, which I think is probably true.
Yes.
But once again, with communication the way it is through the internet, it's easy to have that trusting feel even when you're dealing with someone who you don't know and could not even be in the United States. So certainly it could make you more susceptible if you don't watch for those red flags and make sure you're asking the proper questions.
Do you feel there's a degree of progress that the law enforcement agencies, all of them, are making headway in terms of controlling this, or is it still a pretty difficult challenge that will continue to face law enforcement for maybe years to come?
It's certainly going to continue to be an issue. The reason for that is as we discover the ways that bad guys are laundering their funds or are committing different kinds of fraud, they come up with new and even more sophisticated ways to do their bad deeds. And so we have to learn those new ways they're doing it. Obviously, virtual currency is a new way that bad guys use to launder their funds or commit different fraud schemes. And so we, as law enforcement, we continue to evolve to their new procedures just as they continue to develop new procedures. I think the key to us as Americans to overcoming fraud, and as we talked earlier about, was just the importance of education. We have to make sure that folks understand what warning signs to look for. And like I mentioned before, just asking questions to make sure you understand the purpose of transactions that you're involved in. And doing those things will really help to reduce fraud in the United States and reduce losses to victims.
When you investigate a situation and that results in a conviction for money laundering. What actually happens to the resources that could be millions and millions of dollars? What happens to those funds?
That's a great question. Basically, when we're seizing funds from someone who has stolen those funds from somebody else, that's evidence of a crime. After the case is adjudicated and everything's figured out, those funds get returned by the courts back to the victims. So we're always looking as criminal investigators to do two things. One thing we want to do is we want to gather evidence to put somebody in prison for breaking the law. Mm-hmm. And we also want to be able to seize and forfeit assets to try to make victims as whole as we possibly can.
I see. And as you go through this process, is there any particular period of time that an agent or agents would spend on a case? I would presume, like any other criminal case, that could be a few hours to many months, I would assume.
Well, usually more than a few hours, but some of the quicker cases that I've been a part of have lasted us, a few weeks to a month. But cases can last for multi-year, can be multi-year investigations as well, just based on the complexity of the scheme and the amount of evidence that we need to collect to be able to prove the case.
Is there any particular country that is sort of the source of these ill-gotten gains that you see coming into the United States?
Well, so first of all, Americans make great targets for fraudsters that are overseas, and that's because we have a lot of money. We're a very wealthy country, and so we get targeted a lot, as well as other wealthy countries, but especially the United States, we get targeted by overseas fraudsters looking to steal from us as Americans. Mm-hmm. As far as where those folks are coming from, it's from a number of different countries, and the bottom line from that is all of us as Americans, we really need to be careful anytime as someone is asking us to send money overseas, whether that be as part of a multi-layer transaction that we're a part of, or our own money that we're sending overseas. If the money is going outside the United States, there needs to be a lot of questions asked by folks about that.
You use the term multi-layer. Yeah. What does that mean?
Well, it just means like how many different transactions are involved from the point that someone steals the money to the point that it gets to the bad guy for their use. So, if it's one layer, maybe if, we discussed money mules, if I'm a money mule, then maybe they send it to me and then I send it to the bad guy. That would be just one layer. Mm-hmm. But if they send it to me and then they direct me to send it to 3 or 4 other money mules who then send it to some other money mules and then maybe buy digital currency with it and eventually get it all put back together and then send it overseas to the bad guy who's kind of directing the operation, that level of layering obviously causes more complexity that we have to unravel.
Is it fair to say that the larger the dollar amount, the greater the number of layers? Is there a direct correlation?
You'd think so. I haven't seen that a whole lot. It just depends on how careful the bad guy is being, how much they're trying to, thwart the efforts of law enforcement.
Sure. Would you say that a lot of money laundering incorporates white collar transactions, or are they more drug related or terrorist related?
Well, certainly those other groups launder their funds as well. I'm a fraud investigator, though, so that's most of what I see is money laundering that occurs as part of fraud transactions. Mm-hmm.
Is there a particular case that is unique that kind of stands out in your mind, either because of the layering or the dollar amount or the people involved that you can tell us about?
Well, yeah, I'll tell you a story about a case, but first I just want to mention how damaging these networks can be. And so if any of your viewers either talk to somebody who potentially could be involved in one of these things or that they suspect, they really should get them in touch with law enforcement, because both the money mule themselves is being victimized and they're being used by overseas bad guys to victimize other people. Mm-hmm. Kind of one of the more interesting things that we see is these romance scams. where folks really are not just being victimized financially and also being used as money mules, but they're being victimized emotionally too. It's really very, very sad, and it's becoming more and more common once again as we continue to have more and more interactions with people online. Whereas it's really difficult for your neighbor to steal from you, it's not difficult for you to meet any number of people online who'd be willing to steal from you and don't have any kind of scruples. So, romance scams are some of the saddest crimes that I see as a fraud investigator. Certainly violent crime matters can have a lot more physical damage that people deal with and are horrific and very sad. But as far as fraudulent fraud investigations, I would say romance scams are the saddest ones that we're seeing right now. One, because of the emotional and financial damage, but also because of the level of trust that these fraudsters develop with their victims. They often bleed them of everything that they have, as opposed to if someone invests in a company that's fraudulent and maybe they lose a large amount of money, but it's not all their money. These fraudsters that run these romance scams will take money from the victim until the victim literally has no more money to send.
Right.
It's very sad.
Indeed. Well, we just have time for a couple of more questions. And one is, and we've kind of touched on this before, but have you found that Utah or Salt Lake in particular is experiencing a high level of money laundering, or is that something you can tell us about?
So I can say just in general about fraud, per capita, Utah is the fraud capital of the United States.
Really?
Yeah. Sad statistic for us here.
Why is that?
Well, I think people here are very trusting. We have a very nice community. This is a great place to live. That's the reason that I like to live here. It's because it's a great place to live. But like I said, folks here are very trusting, and we unfortunately see a high level of fraud here. Not to say that New York State, for example, doesn't have a higher fraud dollar amount, but per capita, we're higher here.
I see. Interesting. One final question. If our viewers suspect or feel like there's any type of activity that could be related to money laundering, what do you suggest they do?
Well, they need to find out as much about the transaction as they can and then reach out to law enforcement. We'd be happy to talk to them here with the FBI, or if they want to reach out to their local law enforcement as well, that can be very useful also. Additionally, there's a lot of great resources on our internet fraud website, ic3.gov, that contains information both on fraud schemes, including money laundering, and also contains information on how to file a complaint with the FBI.
Well, that's very interesting information. Thank you so much, Agent Scown, for being with us. And if you feel like you're subject to any type of money laundering activity, please refer to the websites that have been mentioned earlier or contact the local office at the FBI. That concludes this episode of Stringham Real Estate Edge. Today's program was brought to you by Stringham Schools, educating real estate professionals since 1989. Visit stringhamschools.com to learn more. We want to thank today's guests, and don't forget to tell us what you think in the comments section below. I'm Gary Barnes, and I'll see you on the next episode of Stringham Real Estate Edge.